Welcome to Mississippi History from a Christian Perspective. In this course, we'll be studying not only how Mississippi came to be, but also its early inhabitants, how it has impacted and been impacted by the nation, and its history through modern times. Be sure to use the outline to take notes on each topic. In this video, we will cover the early Mississippians, namely the early indigenous people who lived here and their religious beliefs, the missionary efforts to reach them with the gospel, and the revival that occurred among these people. Who were the earliest Mississippians? They had no written language, and what we know of them and their customs is largely drawn from archaeological evidence. It was not until the advent of European explorers who recorded their contacts with the indigenous peoples that we obtained specific information. Some of them tell a historical account describing how they left their home in the west, or the land of the setting sun, to travel to the place the sun god directed them. Most historians believe this is the story of how they crossed the North American land bridge from Asia to North America through Alaska. These were the peoples discovered by early explorers like Hernando de Soto, who explored and wrote about the area around the Mississippi River. The Natchez are a Native American people who originally lived in the Natchez Bluff area near Natchez, Mississippi. The name, belonging to a single town, was extended to the tribe and an entire group of town, including people of different blood who had been conquered by or had taken refuge with the Natchez. On his trek up the river in 1699, one explorer described 8 tribal towns in addition to the town of Natchez. It's inferred that the 9 towns represented the entire Natchez group. While most American Indian nations were egalitarian, meaning they had no social class, this was not the case among the Natchez. They had the most elaborate and well-developed social stratification found among Indian nations. At the top was the Great Sun and his select group of wives and relatives. Next came the tier of high nobles, followed by less nobles, otherwise known as honored men. Underneath those stood the commoners, who were also called stinkards. Finally were the slaves, who were typically prisoners of war. The Natchez and other tribes of the lower Mississippi River occupied a somewhat atypical position among the Indians in that they seem to have been strictly sedentary, depending for their livelihood chiefly upon agriculture. They developed considerable skill in the arts and wove a textile fabric from the inner bark of the mulberry tree, which they employed for clothing. They made excellent pottery and raised mounds of earth upon which to erect their dwellings and temples. They were also one of the eastern tribes that practiced head flattening. The Great Sun was essentially a king who made all the decisions and directed the Natchez people. The Natchez people then gave him all that they had, and he redistributed it as he saw fit. The Natchez worshipped their leader, the Great Sun, as the one who was placed there by the sun god, and they performed ritual human sacrifice upon the death of their son. Whenever a male son died, his wives were expected to accompany him by performing ritual suicide. Mothers sometimes sacrificed infants in such ceremonies as an act which conferred honor and special status to the mother. Relatives of those who chose ritual suicide were likewise honored and rose in status. It was a strongly matrilineal society with descent recognized along female lines. Leadership passed from the chief to his sister's son, which ensured that the chiefdom stayed in one clan. Persons of the Sun caste were required to marry commoners, and the offspring of a female son and a commoner were sons, while the offspring of a male son and commoners were a part of the caste of honored people. The French explored the lower Mississippi River in the late 17th century. Initial French Natchez encounters were mixed. In 1682, 2 explorers led an expedition down the river, and the Natchez received the party well, but when they returned upriver, they were met by a hostile force of about 1,500 warriors and hurried away. At the time of the next French visit in the 1690s, the Natchez were welcoming and friendly. In the 1710s and 20s, war broke out 4 times between the French and the Natchez. The French called these the First, Second, and Third Natchez War, and the final one they called the Natchez Rebellion of 1729. The last of these was the largest, in which the Natchez destroyed the French settlements in their territory. In retaliation, the French killed or deported most of the Natchez people. It overshadowed the first three in such scale and importance that the rebellion is often simply called the Natchez War. The Chickasaw. The designation as civilized is an indication that they had acquired many elements of the European cultures and were the most acculturated Indian tribes during the 19th century. Even though the Natchez had the most stratified social system, they were not considered one of the five civilized indigenous tribes because of their human sacrifice and their infanticide practices. Like the other Indian nations of the Southeast, though, the Chickasaw were an agricultural people who raised corn, beans, squash, melons, and sunflowers. Fishing and hunting supplemented their agricultural diet as well. The Chickasaw had their own version of the story of the Great Flood as handed down through generations well before the Europeans arrived. They told about how he who lived above the clouds sent rain until they had to make many rafts. The rafts fell apart, and only one family and two of every animal remained on the tallest mountain. They traditionally followed a kinship system of matrilineal descent. Children are born into the mother's family and clan and gain their social status from her. Women, likewise, controlled most property, and hereditary leadership in the tribe passed through the maternal line. The Chickasaw are believed to have migrated into Mississippi from the west, as their oral history attests. They and the Choctaw were believed to be one people once and migrated together from the west of the Mississippi River into present day Mississippi. The Chickasaw and Choctaw split somewhere along the way. They built complex, dense villages supporting a stratified society and settled into the upper Yazoo and Pearl River valleys in present day Mississippi. It was believed by the Chickasaw that Abba Beni Lee lived above the clouds and on earth with unpolluted people. He is the sole creator of warmth, light, and all animal and vegetable life. The Chickasaw worshipped him in smoke and cloud, believing him to reside above the clouds and in the element of the holy fire. Explanations of natural phenomena and descriptions of one's place in the universe were common themes in their beliefs as well. Chickasaw elders conveyed traditional knowledge to the younger generations to keep traditions and tribal stories alive, thereby instilling in younger generations cultural identity and tribal cohesiveness. The stories of the elders had significance in describing tribal history not in terms of chronological order, but more in terms of how events and locations impacted nature and the people. Their ceremony, the busk or the green corn ceremony, is the central and most festive holiday for the people. It represents not only the renewal of the annual cycle, but of the spirit and the traditions of many of the southeastern indigenous peoples. It's representative of the return of summer, the ripening of new corn, and the common Native American traditions of environmental and agricultural renewal. The Choctaw. The Choctaw and Chickasaw share a verbal history of leaving the land of the setting sun, led by two brothers, Chickasaw and Choctaw, to the Mississippi Valley area. Then the group split in two, and each group was led by one of the brothers. The Choctaw are believed to have coalesced in the 1600s. They were also sedentary agricultural people with stratified societies. Some of their communities had extensive trade and interaction with Europeans, including people from Spain, France, and England, and that greatly shaped their culture as well. After the United States was formed and its settlers began to move into the Southeast, the Choctaw were among the five civilized tribes who adopted some of their ways. They transitioned to yeoman farming methods and accepted European Americans and African Americans into their society. These people had a matrilineal kinship system also, with children born of the clan of the mother and taking their social status from her. Each town or village was also led by what was called a mingo, which is somewhat like a mayor. And this mayor was elected through matrilineal approval, not by birthright. The Choctaw, like the Chickasaw, believed in one supreme ruler who lived above the clouds, and that their people, if they were good, went to live with him upon their death. The Choctaw were known for their compassion and would readily take in abandoned or orphaned children of any race. During the potato famine, 1 million Irish people immigrated, while another million died. The Choctaw took compassion upon these people who lived so far away from them, and in 1847 charitably sent the Irish $170, which in today's money would be about $5,000. The generosity created a bond between the Irish and the Choctaw that persists today. In 2018, Ireland created a scholarship for Choctaw youth, saying to them, "Your act of kindness has never been and never will be forgotten in Ireland." Most Choctaw allied with the Americans during the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Red Stick War, most notably at the Battle of New Orleans. European Americans considered the Choctaw people to be, of course, one of the 5 civilized tribes of the Southeast. The Choctaw and the U.S. agreed to a total of 9 treaties, but by the last 3, the U.S. gained vast land cessions in the Southeast. As part of the Indian removal, despite not having waged war against the U.S., the majority of Choctaw were forcibly relocated to Indian Territory from 1831 to 1833. Those Choctaw who chose to stay in the state of Mississippi were considered state and U.S. citizens. They were one of the first major non-European ethnic groups to be granted citizenship. There is still representation of the Choctaw lineage alive in Mississippi to this day. From the beginning of European exploration and settlement of Mississippi, there were missionary efforts throughout the territory. Each of the early explorers carried with them Catholic priests who sought to convert the Indians to their religion. Such efforts, however, were met with great difficulty, and there are accounts given of some that were burned at the stake by some of the more fierce tribes. Early colonial preachers used the Natchez Trace as a door to outreach. The first preacher to ever travel the Trace was a Baptist pastor by the name of Reverend Joseph Bullen. Reverend Bullen was probably the first to evangelize the Chickasaw tribe. He came to their main city called Old Town on May 20th of 1799. Bullen remained with the tribe for 5 years, preaching and ministering to them before moving on. The first Methodist preacher on the Trace was Tobias Gibson, who also arrived later in 1799. Gibson's circuit was over 600 miles long, and later a man named Moses Floyd joined him. Gibson constantly pleaded by letter and personal appeal for more missionaries to enter the field of the southern wilderness. One of the most colorful evangelists was a Methodist by the name of Lorenzo Dow. He only accepted gifts when the people had it to give, and often sold his own property to care for the needs of the people. He used stage props and skits to illustrate biblical concepts to the people so they could more fully understand its messages. Missionary efforts reached their peak in Mississippi during the 1800s. This period saw construction of several mission schools which were built for the purpose of teaching first biblical truths, household skills, and then better agricultural methods to the people. The Elliott Mission was located 3 miles south of the Yallabusha River near present-day Hawka, Mississippi, under the direction of Cyrus Kingsbury. It was begun at the request of the Choctaw Mingo Captain Perry. Not only did the mission serve as a school for the children and employment for some of the young adults, it served as a church for the Choctaw people. Between 1818 and 1820, the Choctaw and the missionaries had constructed 24 buildings and cleared 60 acres of land. The Choctaw lands held 9 of the 13 mission schools. To effectively accomplish the goals of the mission, they knew they had to be able to communicate. 2 missionaries, Reverend Alfred Wright and Dr. Cyrus Byington, moved to the residence of the influential Choctaw chief and began working on the Choctaw language. Not only did they create the first written form of the Choctaw language, but they translated large portions of the Bible into Choctaw. They began teaching the children how to read the written Choctaw language as well as the English language, and began preaching sermons in Choctaw. They also created the first Choctaw language dictionary. Another tool used by the missionaries was camp meetings, where evangelists would set up tents and have retreats for several days at a time, where they would immerse the Choctaw people in the Word 24/7. The zeal of the meeting resulted in many converts. One well known convert was Greenwood LaFleur, an influential and wealthy chief among the Choctaw. By 1828, a revival movement was sweeping the Choctaw Nation, and many Choctaw towns were requesting their own camp meetings be held. One of the chiefs was noted as saying that they would be better to stay there till the flesh dried to their bones than leave without the gospel in their heart. Prior to this, 15 to 20 individuals would typically attend camp meetings, but now 300 to 500 people crowded each attendance. An outgrowth of this revival was the desire of the Choctaw people to read their own language. Many of the schools were enlarged and other schools opened for adults. The Choctaw also composed and published their own hymn book in 1829. On September 27th of 1830, the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek was signed. This stated that all Choctaws who desired to remain under tribal law would have to remove to land designated as Indian Territory located west of the Mississippi River in Oklahoma. Those who remained would take land allotments and come under the laws of the state. Large sums of money were spent by unscrupulous men to bribe the tribe to sign the treaty that would then remove them from what they had come to view as their ancestral homeland. After the Indian Removal Act was finally implemented in 1837, the number of Indians residing in Mississippi was significantly reduced. This created what we call the Trail of Tears. The term Trail of Tears invokes the collective suffering those Indians experienced. The physical trail consisted of several overland routes and one main water route and stretched some 5,045 miles. This stretched across portions of 9 states: Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Illinois, Kentucky, Missouri, North Carolina, Oklahoma, and Tennessee, depending upon where the people began their route from. Many missionaries traversed the Trail of Tears with the Indians. One such was Dr. Wright, who became the attending physician for many of the sick along the way. Later, after Cyrus Kingsbury closed the mission schools that had been under his leadership, he followed the tribe to Oklahoma, where he continued to serve them with new mission schools there until his death. For more information about the Trail of Tears, you can go to www.britannica.com/event/Trail of Tears. In our next lesson, we will discuss the early explorers, new efforts by France, and English rule. This has been your host, Tracy Robinson. Be sure to like, subscribe, and ring that bell to never miss a video. Thanks for learning with me.